If you looked at the city from above, through the layer of slate gray clouds that had settled over the Pacific Northwest like a heavy woolen blanket, you would see a grid of lights shimmering through the mist. You would see the Space Needle standing like a lonely beacon. You would see the ferries cutting white lines across the dark water of Puget Sound, but if you zoomed in past the skyline, past the busy arterials, and focused on a brick apartment complex in the Capitol Hill district, you would find a different kind of geography. You would find the geography of silence, apartment 4B. Inside. Sarah Vance sat on a beige sofa that she had bought 3 months ago because it looked neutral. That was the word she kept using to describe her new life: neutral, safe, uncomplicated. Sarah is 34 years old. She is a woman who, until recently, defined herself by her forward momentum. She was a curator for a mid-sized art gallery. She was a fiancée. She was a planner. She was the person who knew what she would be doing next Christmas and the Christmas after that. Now, she was a woman staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of an island. She would never visit. It was 9:15 p.m., the time of night when the day is officially dead. But sleep is still a distant country. Sarah held a book in her lap. The History of Pigments and Renaissance Art. She had been on page 42 for 20 minutes. Her eyes traced the lines, but her mind was drifting, caught in the undertow of the past. She wasn't thinking about the big fights, the screaming matches, the dramatic shattering of plates. Those things are easy to process because they are loud. No, Sarah was thinking about the quiet erosion, the way her engagement to Evan hadn't exploded. It had evaporated. It was the slow realization that she was living with a stranger who happened to know her coffee order. It was the morning she woke up, looked at the man sleeping beside her, and felt nothing, not hate, not love, just a profound, terrifying emptiness. So she left. She packed her life into 40 cardboard boxes. She signed a lease on this apartment because it had big windows and hardwood floors. She told herself that a new zip code was a reset button. She told herself that solitude was just a fancy word for freedom. But 3 months in, the freedom felt heavy. The silence in apartment 4B wasn't peaceful. It was thick. It had a weight to it. It pressed against her ears. It filled the corners of the room like a gas. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the floorboards, the rush of water in the pipes, sound like an intrusion. Sarah stood up. The movement was sudden, a physical rejection of her own thoughts. She needed to move. She needed to make a noise just to prove she still existed. She walked to the kitchen island. Her socks slid silently on the polished wood. She filled the electric kettle. While the water heated. Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. A pale face framed by dark hair that was pulled back in a loose, messy bun. Tired eyes. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Tea, she whispered to the empty room. Just tea. She was building a fortress of small routines. Wake up, coffee, work, home tea, book, sleep. If she kept the walls of the fortress high enough, the loneliness couldn't get in. Or so she thought. She poured the water over a chamomile bag. The steam rose, curling into the cool air. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into her palms. It was her only source of warmth. She walked back toward the living room, intending to turn off the lamp and surrender to the night. And then it happened. Soundscape. The rain continues. Then distinct and sharp knock. Knock, knock. Sarah froze. The sound was alien. It didn't belong in the soundscape of her evening. She stood in the middle of her living room, the mug trembling slightly in her hand. Her heart did a strange acrobatic flip in her chest. It wasn't a delivery. It was too late for UPS. It wasn't a friend. She hadn't given this address to anyone except her mother and her boss. and neither of them would drop by nearly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. Maybe she imagined it. The building was old, pipes groaned, wood warped. Maybe it was just the house settling. She waited. She held her breath, straining her ears against the sound of the rain. No. It was real. Someone was standing on the other side of her door. Sarah set the mug down on a coaster. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Fear pricked at the back of her neck, the urban woman's instinct. But beneath the fear was something else. Curiosity, hope. She walked to the door. The hardwood floor creaked under her weight. She reached the entryway and pressed her eye to the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the hallway, bending the walls into a tunnel. The lighting out there was dim, a sickly yellow buzz from the overhead fluorescent tube, but she recognized the figure standing on her welcome. Matt. It was the man from 4D. She didn't know his name. She knew him as the gray coat. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times in the last 3 months. They had shared the elevator ride down to the lobby. They had exchanged the polite, tight-lipped nods that city neighbors trade, the universal code for "I acknowledge your existence, but please don't speak to me." She knew he was tall. She knew he had brown hair that always looked a little windblown. She knew he carried a leather messenger bag, and she knew that he had sad eyes. The kind of eyes that looked at the floor numbers change on the elevator panel as if they were counting down a sentence. But tonight, through the peephole, he didn't look just sad. He looked unraveled. He was wearing a gray sweater that looked damp at the shoulders. His hands were in his pockets. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking down at his shoes, then back up at her door, then down again. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to step back or jump. Sarah unlocked the deadbolt. Soundscape, the heavy, mechanical clack of the lock turning, the squeak of the hinge as the door opens. She opened the door a few inches, keeping her body in the gap, a barrier between her sanctuary and the hallway. "Hello?" she said. Her voice sounded rusty to her own ears. The man looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. Not the redness of allergies, but the raw, swollen redness of a man who has been weeping and trying desperately to stop. He blinked, as if the light from her apartment hurt him. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to bother you. I know it's late." Sarah loosened her grip on the doorframe. The fear evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. She recognized the look on his face. She had seen it in the mirror every morning for the last 90 days. It was the look of someone who has run out of distractions. "It's okay," Sarah said, opening the door a little wider. You're in 4D, right?" He nodded. "Mark, my name is Mark. I'm Sarah." "Hi, Sarah." He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. I didn't know where else to go. I was sitting in my living room and..." He stopped. He looked past her into the warm, yellow light of her apartment. He looked at the bookshelf. He looked at the rug. He looked like a starving man staring at a feast. "I couldn't handle the quiet," he whispered. I couldn't be in there alone for one more minute." The confession hung in the air between them. It was raw. It was improper for a stranger. It was undeniably human. Sarah looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the way his hands were shaking slightly. And she realized that sending him away would be an act of cruelty she wasn't capable of. "Do you..." Sarah hesitated, then stepped back, fully opening the door. "Do you want to come in?" Mark looked at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to be a creep." You aren't a creep, Mark," Sarah said softly. "You look like you need a cup of tea. And I just made a pot." He exhaled, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. 2 sounds. Tea sounds good. He stepped over the threshold. Soundscape. The sound of the door closing softly, shutting out the hum of the hallway. The acoustic shift to the warmer, softer interior of the apartment. Sarah locked the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking shut felt different this time. It wasn't locking the world out. It was locking something new in. Shoes? Mark asked, gesturing to his feet. It's fine, Sarah said. Just come in. Sit down. She led him into the living room. Mark walked tentatively, his eyes scanning the space. He didn't look with judgment. He looked with hunger. He took in the stack of art books, the half-finished painting in the corner, the soft throw blanket on the sofa. It's nice in here, he said quietly. It feels lived in. It's getting there, Sarah replied. Take a seat. I'll get another mug. She went to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking now, too. Why? Why was her heart hammering against her ribs? It wasn't attraction, not yet, anyway. It was the shock of connection. For 3 months, this apartment had been a silo. Now, suddenly, there was another frequency in the room. She poured the tea, chamomile, honey. When she returned, Mark was sitting on the edge of the beige sofa. He was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. He was staring at the window, watching the rain streak against the glass dots. Sarah set the mug on the coffee table in front of him. Sarah sat in the armchair opposite him. She tucked her legs under her. She waited. She knew, from her own experience, that grief has its own timeline. You can't rush it. You just have to sit with it until it's ready to speak. The clock on the wall. Tick, dot, tick, tick, tick. Finally, Mark took a breath. A long, shuddering inhalation. I signed the papers today, he said. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the tea. The final decree. It came in the mail. A big manila envelope. Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see her. Divorce? Yeah, I'm sorry. Don't be, Mark said bittersweetly. It's been over for a long time. Years, maybe. But seeing it on paper, seeing the ink, it makes it absolute. He took a sip of the tea. He grimaced slightly at the heat, but he seemed to welcome the sensation. We were married for 8 years, he continued. Together for 10. I don't really remember how to be a singular person. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, grounding. I wasn't married, but I was engaged. 5 years. We broke it off 3 months ago. Mark looked up then. His eyes met hers. There was a spark of recognition, a shared language of loss. Is that why you're here? He asked, gesturing vaguely to the apartment walls. In the complex? Yes, Sarah said. This is my retreat, my bunker. Mine too, Mark said. He looked around the room again. I moved in 2 weeks ago. Most of my boxes are still taped shut. I can't bring myself to open them, because if I open them, it means I live here. And if I live here, it means I don't live there anymore. The geometry of loneliness, Sarah murmured. Mark looked at her, intrigued. What? It's something I read once, Sarah said, feeling slightly self-conscious. That loneliness changes the shape of the room you're in. It stretches the corners. It raises the ceiling. It makes you feel small. Mark nodded slowly. That's exactly it. Tonight, the ceiling in my apartment felt like it was 10 miles high. I turned on the TV, but the noise just made it worse. I turned it off, and the silence was violent. That's the only word for it, violent. He put the mug down. He looked at his hands. I didn't want to be alone, he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. And I remembered seeing you in the elevator. You always have paint on your hands. Or a book. You seemed calm. I thought, maybe she knows. Knows what? How to be quiet without being empty. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. It was a profound compliment and a profound lie. She didn't know how to do that. She was faking it every day. But looking at Mark, seeing the raw need in his posture, she realized that tonight, for the first time in 3 months, she wasn't faking it. I'm still learning, Sarah said honestly. Some days are better than others. Some days the silence wins. Today the silence was winning, Mark said. Until you opened the door. They sat there for a long time. The rain continued to batter the city outside, washing away the grime of the day. But inside apartment 4B, the atmosphere had shifted. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was charged. They talked. Not about the weather. Not about their jobs. They talked about the specific texture of heartbreak. Mark told her about the house he left behind a craftsman in Queen Anne that he had restored with his own hands. He was an architect, he revealed. He designed spaces for other people to fill with memories while he had lost his own. Sarah told him about the gallery, about the feeling of standing in front of a painting and realizing that the artist had felt exactly what she was feeling. 400 years ago, art is just a way of saying, I was here and it hurt and it was beautiful. Sarah said. Mark looked at her. The redness in his eyes had faded, replaced by a soft, thoughtful intensity. I like that, he said. It hurt and it was beautiful. The clock chimed 11. Mark blinked, as if waking from a trance. He looked at his watch and flinched. Oh God, he said, standing up quickly. It's 11 o'clock. I've kept you up. I'm so sorry. I lost track. It's okay, Sarah said, standing up as well. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of disappointment. She didn't want him to leave. She didn't want the silence to rush back in. I don't sleep much anyway. Thank you, Mark said. He stood in the center of the living room, looking at her. Really, Sarah, thank you. You saved me tonight. I don't mean to be dramatic, but you did, I think. Sarah paused. I think maybe we saved each other. Mark smiled. It was a small, tentative thing. A crack in the ice. Good night, Sarah. Good night, Mark. He walked to the door. Sarah followed. He stepped out into the hallway, back into the harsh fluorescent light. He looked back at her one last time, a silent message passing between them. Then the door clicked shut. Soundscape. The sound of the lock turning. The return of the ambient room tone. The rain. But the ticking clock sounds less oppressive now. The music swells a gentle, hopeful piano melody. Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door. She closed her eyes. The apartment was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a seed planted in the dark, waiting for the rain to stop, waiting for the sun to rise. She walked back to the living room. She picked up Mark's empty mug. It was still warm. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Somewhere in the reflection of the glass, she saw herself. And for the first time in 90 days, she didn't look like a ghost. She looked like a woman who had just heard a knock and decided to answer. Sarah stood in her kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter. The smell of dark roast coffee filled the air, usually a scent that signaled the start of her armor-plating routine. But today, the armor felt thin. She looked at the empty mug sitting in the sink. Mark's mug. She hadn't washed it yet. It sat there, a ceramic witness to the fact that the night before hadn't been a fever dream. There is a specific emotional state that follows a night of unexpected confession. Psychologists might call it a vulnerability hangover. It's that prickly, exposed feeling you get when you realize you've given a stranger the map to your minefield. You wake up and think, did I say too much? Did I look desperate? Does he think I'm broken? Sarah dressed for work. A charcoal blazer. a silk scarf, the uniform of the competent curator. But as she walked to the door to leave, she hesitated. She stared at the deadbolt dot. Opening that door meant entering the hallway. The hallway meant potential intersection. The neutral zone between apartment 4B and apartment 4D had been demilitarized last night, but in the cold light of 8 a.m., Sarah wasn't sure if the truth still held. She took a breath, unlocked the door, and stepped out. Soundscape, the hollow, echoing sound of footsteps in a hallway, a door closing, silence. The hallway was empty. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was a mixture of relief and, if she was being honest, a sharp, sinking disappointment. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. As she waited, watching the numbers descend, she glanced toward 4D. The door was shut tight. No sound came from behind it. It looked like any other door in the building, unremarkable, painted a standard issue off-white. But to Sarah, it looked like a mouth kept shut. She went to work. Soundscape, a transition to the sounds of an art gallery. The hushed, reverent quiet of a museum space. The click of heels on polished concrete. Low, murmuring voices. The gallery was preparing for a new exhibition, abstract landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. Sarah spent the day directing art handlers, adjusting lighting, and answering emails. She was good at her job. She had an eye for balance, for how colors interacted in a space. But all day, she felt dislocated. She would be staring at a canvas, a splash of violet blue oil paint, and she would see Mark's hands holding the tea mug. She would be nodding at a donor's banal complaint about the wine selection, and she would hear Mark's voice saying, "I don't remember how to be a singular person." The connection hadn't just been about shared grief. It was about shared frequency. It was like finding someone who spoke a dialect you thought had died out. At 5:30 p.m., Sarah packed her bag. She didn't stay late. She didn't go to the gym. She drove straight home. Soundscape, rain again. The sound of a key in a lock. The door opens. When she got back to the hallway, she saw it. It wasn't a person. It was a small, folded piece of paper, slipped halfway under her door. Sarah froze. She dropped her keys into her purse and bent down. She pulled the paper out. It was a sheet of graph paper, the kind architects use. The grid lines were pale blue. She unfolded it. The handwriting was architectural. All caps, precise, clean lines. Sarah. I woke up afraid that I overshopped last night, that I dumped too much wreckage at your feet. But then I remembered the tea. Thank you for the quiet. IT was the first time I've slept through the night in weeks. Marcus. Sarah stood in her entryway, reading the note for the third time. A smile, unbidden and genuine, bloomed on her face. It wasn't a romantic note. It wasn't a love letter. It was an acknowledgement. I see you. You saw me. We are okay. She placed the note on her kitchen counter, pinning it under the fruit bowl. That night, nobody knocked. Thursday passed. Friday passed. The silence returned. Soundscape. The rain is lighter now, a soft drizzle. The sound of a jazz record playing very quietly in the background. Then knock, knock, knock. Sarah was ready this time. She didn't freeze. She put down her brush she had been trying to paint, failing to capture the light, but trying, and walked to the door. She opened it. Mark was there. He looked different. The gray sweater was gone, replaced by a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. He looked less like a man on the edge of a cliff and more like a man who had stepped back to admire the view. However terrifying it might be, he was holding something. A bottle of wine. "Hi," he said. His voice was steady. "Hi," Sarah answered. "I didn't want to show up empty-handed twice," he said, lifting the bottle slightly. "It's a Pinot Noir Oregon. I figured tea was good, but maybe wine is better for a Saturday." Sarah stepped back. "Come in, Mark." This time, there was no hesitation at the threshold. He stepped in as if the groove in the floorboards already knew the shape of his boots. They moved to the living room. Sarah turned off the overhead light, leaving only the warm glow of the floor lamp. It created a pool of intimacy in the center of the beige room. She went to the kitchen to get glasses. When she returned, Mark was standing by her easel in the corner. He was looking at the canvas, a chaotic swirl of grays and muted yellows. "It's terrible," Sarah said, setting the glasses down. "Don't look at it." Mark shook his head. He didn't turn away. "It's not terrible. It's noisy. Yeah, Mark said, turning to her. "It looks like static, like the sound of a radio between stations." Sarah felt a shiver. That was exactly what she had been trying to paint. The feeling of being in between. "You have a good eye for an architect," she said, pouring the wine. "Occupational hazard?" He smiled. He took the glass she offered. "We spend our lives trying to impose order on chaos, artists. You guys embrace the chaos." "I think I'm trying to paint my way out of the chaos," Sarah admitted. They sat down. Mark took the armchair again. Sarah took the sofa. The distance between them was about 4 feet, but emotionally, they were sitting on the same raft. The conversation that night flowed differently. The desperation of Tuesday was gone, replaced by a tentative exploration. They were like two explorers comparing maps of the same territory. Mark talked about his work. He told her about a library he was designing in Spokane. "I'm trying to figure out the lighting," he said, leaning forward, his hands shaping the air. "I want it to feel like, when you're a kid and you read under the covers with a flashlight, that feeling of a private world. I want a public building to feel like that." Sarah listened, mesmerized not just by his words, but by his passion. He wasn't just a sad man in 4D anymore. He was a creator. He was a man who thought about light and safety. "That sounds beautiful," she said. "The architecture of intimacy." Mark looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Exactly. Most people just want big glass boxes. They want to be seen. I think most people actually want to hide. They just don't want to be lonely while they do it. Is that what we're doing?" Sarah asked softly. "Hiding?" Mark swirled the wine in his glass. The red liquid caught the light. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we're just recovering. Recovery takes a specific kind of space. You can't heal in a crowded room." He told her more about his divorce. Not the legal details, but the sensory ones. The way the house felt when his wife took her books off the shelves. The phantom sound of her keys in the door. Sarah countered with stories of Evan. She told him about the engagement ring. How heavy it felt on her finger, like a shackle made of diamond. "I gave it back," Sarah said. "And the moment it was off my hand, I felt lighter. Physically lighter. But then I realized that I didn't know what to do with my hands." Mark nodded. "I still reach for the phone to text her," he admitted. "Something funny will happen, or I'll see a weird dog, and my thumb goes to her name. And then I remember. It's like hitting a wall at 60 miles an hour 5 times a day. Does it get better?" Sarah asked. It was the question she had been asking herself for 90 days. Mark looked at the window. The rain was gentle now, weeping softly against the glass. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I really don't, but..." He turned back to her. "Tonight, sitting here, talking to you, I haven't reached for my phone once." The air in the room shifted. It wasn't charged with romance, exactly. It was too fragile for that. It was charged with relief. They sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't the heavy silence of Tuesday. It was a companionable silence. The kind of silence you share with someone when you don't need to perform. Sarah looked at Mark's hands. They were strong, capable hands. hands that drew lines and built walls. And she realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about her own hands being empty. "Do you want to see something?" Mark asked suddenly. "What?" "The roof," he said. "Have you been up there?" "No, it's always locked." Mark grinned, a boyish expression that took 10 years off his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "One of the perks of being an architect. I convinced the super that I needed to inspect the structural integrity of the parapet." He gave me a copy. Sarah laughed. "You lied to the super?" "I prefer to call it creative access negotiation. Come on." Soundscape. The sound of them walking up a concrete stairwell. Their footsteps echo. A heavy metal door creaks open. The sound of the city expands, wind, distant sirens, the hum of the highway. But vast and open, they stepped onto the roof. The air was cold and wet, smelling of ozone and sea salt. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and glittering dot below them. Seattle was a galaxy of lights. Sarah walked to the edge, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. Mark stood beside her, close enough to block the wind, but not touching. "Look at that," Mark said, sweeping his hand across the horizon. "A million little boxes, a million little lives. It makes you feel small," Sarah said. "No," Mark corrected her. "It makes you feel part of it. When you're in the apartment, you're isolated. Up here, you're just one light in the grid. We're all down there just trying to keep the lights on." Sarah looked at him. In the blue light of the city, his profile was sharp, defined. "I'm glad you knocked," she said. The wind took her words, but he heard them. He turned to her. "I'm glad you opened the door." They stood there for a long time, watching the city breathe. They were two shipwrecked sailors who had found the same island. They didn't know if they would be rescued. They didn't know if they would build a house there. All they knew was that they weren't swimming alone in the dark anymore. Soundscape. The wind swells. A slow fade out to the gentle, rhythmic sound of the city at night. Narrator. The roof was the beginning of the we. But gravity always pulls you back down. And down in the building, the past has a way of finding the cracks in the walls.